So I'm really excited about today's episode because we're finally discussing this book, Less is More by Jason Hickel. And this is the book that Douglas and I really, it kind of inspired us to even begin to start the show, Breaking the Spell. Because we were talking a lot about degrowth, which is what this book is about. And degrowth is something, degrowth is an antidote to growth, right? And growth is something that I think affects all of us, our society. And so that's why we felt that this was a spell that we needed to break. That was one of the inspirations for the show. So this book is it's so well written. And so I just want to talk a little bit about what I liked about it, and then we can have a discussion. So I think one of the things that Jason Hickel does really well in this book is really trace the history of growth, passed through hundreds of years, starting from 500 years ago with even the history of Europe. A lot of people don't know this, but the elites in Europe, they kicked their peasants off the land in something called the enclosure movement. And then because of that, the peasants started having to work in factories, and that was really the rise of industrialization. But even beyond that, they continued that trend of extraction by colonizing other countries and even extracting labor from those other countries and bringing it to the Americas. So I think it's important that he traces the history of where we are today, because a lot of us, when we look around at the world and we're trying to think, where did we go wrong, right? It's important to be able to retrace those steps, because otherwise, you just think, oh, things just always have to be the way they are, right? But you realize, actually, we made choices as a civilization of where we want it to go. So there are a lot of other books that kind of talk on similar themes, but I think what Jason Hickel does really well is really come at it from a moral point of view, sort of like the injustice of what's been happening. And that really kind of lit a fire under me, so to speak, right? And he also covers a lot of other ground. Even just looking at the contemporary world, he doesn't give you too much data or information. He gives you just enough to understand certain, let's say, patterns of consumption. Like the fact that, the global north, which is the OECD countries, even though they are only 20% of the world's population, but they're responsible for 80% of all the carbon emissions that are put into the atmosphere. Or even just simple things there's little things that I enjoy reading about. The meat consumption in India is about 4 kg of meat per person per year, right? And then in Kenya, it's something like maybe 20 kg. And then in the US, it's 120 kg, So when you think about it that way, 120 kg in the US versus 4 kg in India, you really see these differences in consumption. And I think the overall point that he's trying to make in the book is that growth is actually good for low-income countries. Those are countries where they don't have enough infrastructure, they don't have enough health and education, and those countries actually need to grow. What we're talking about with degrowth is actually more of how resources are distributed. And it's the unfair distribution of resources in the world today that is the cause of a lot of our problems, right? So I think he states very clearly that people don't have to be afraid of this word degrowth. I mean, if you're living in a poor country, or even if you're in a rich country, but you're one of the ones that are marginalized, right? Degrowth is actually trying to say that resources should be directed towards your basic essentials, like your health and education. One of his criticisms of growth and capitalism is that the growth that capitalism tries to drive is growth in productive capacity. So like when you make a profit, a lot of companies and a lot of capitalists, they would take that profit and put it into buying more machines and more technology that increases their extractive capability, right? So it's how those surpluses are invested that's the problem. And then, I'll just briefly jump to his conclusion. What is the solution? Because it's not good to just be pessimistic about everything. He does think there are very simple policy implications of this. One is that we should really, as a society, start thinking about cutting down on industries that we don't need. Like most of advertising, we actually don't need as a society. All it does is make us want to consume things that we don't need, right? Or military spending, do we really need that? And he also interestingly refers to indigenous cultures as one of the solutions, because if you look at Native Americans or the Aborigines in Australia, they were people who lived very close to the land. They saw themselves as stewards of the land, and they really took care of the land. And there's so much wisdom in that. And the basic core wisdom of indigenous cultures is you give back more than what you take. And this is the reverse of capitalism today, because capitalism today is about taking more than what you give. And it's just that reversal that is the key move that we need to make. So yeah, I'll end my short review, but I really think everyone should read this book because it's so well written and quite gripping.
Actually, Santosh, have you read the book?
I didn't read the book. I just read part of the summary.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
but I found a certain resonance to the content and the themes that were explored. And these were themes that are not new to me. And I totally agree with where you're coming from. Yeah.
So I think one thing we want our audience to know is that actually the three of us sort of came together in a, surreptitious moment, right? Because you and I found that we have this common love for the book, right? And like you said just now, I also echo the same sentiments, right? This book literally lit a fire in me as well. And for me, the reason why this book is so close to my heart is because I felt like after reading so much on environmentalism, activism, I feel that when it comes to climate change, we really need a succinct and very concise way of defining the problem and trying to also answer it, right? And I think for me, what is currently the failure in contemporary discourse about environmentalism is living up to individual behavior change. And I really, really refute that. And I can expand on that a little bit more later. So this is one reason why I think this book is so powerful, because it doesn't try to advocate that kind of philosophy. It's very clear on the idea that it's a systemic and, in some sense, spiritual change as well that's required. Yeah, but the idea is that it needs to be on a very, very large scale. So, that's really, what I really love about the book. So, Santosh, the thing is that for you, you didn't read the book, but you obviously came across the concept of degrowth due to your years of studying in France. So, why don't you just share with the audience a really lived experience of it? How did you come across it? Did you see it play out within French society? And even bring us to the origin of the word degrowth, right? It's a French word, right? So talk about that.
Absolutely. So the origin of the word degrowth, it's la décroissance. Yeah, not croissance as the pastry that you eat. Yeah, but it's degrowth, la décroissance, the movement de la décroissance. And I was exposed to this word when I first arrived in France, and it took me by surprise because I was part of the Singapore Economic Development Board, and I thought that economic development was the central idea to nation building or progress. But when I went to France, a lot of people counted where I was coming from, and they were saying that it's not all about economic development or growth. We need to look at degrowth. And that was my first encounter with le mouvement, la décroissance. Now, at the essence of it, there's a caricature. There's a joke around this. Travailler plus pour gagner plus pour dépenser plus. Work more to earn more to spend more. And then the cycle continues. And that is what they have made an entire mockery out of, because it's not sustainable. Now, there was one other thing about my experience in France that was quite fascinating, and it was to look at the seasons of life or seasons in an entire year. You have spring, and then you have summer, and then there is autumn and winter before spring comes back again. Therein, in nature, lies the secrets to how human beings can relate with our own selves as well as with nature. So you have spring and summer, that's when you start to grow. But after summer, you collect your harvest. And after collecting the harvest, that's time for you to rest and not grow again. And so inbuilt within the mechanisms of nature and in seasons is a very precious lesson to us that we can't grow infinitely. And so seasons of life, where I was studying, were a very good teacher for me. Now, there's another thing that I was exposed to. I was actually part of this Grandes Écoles. These are the French engineering schools set up by Napoleon. Yeah, and the name of my school was called École Nationale Supérieure des Mines, meaning it was School of Mining. My school was all about mining in the past. It was extractive and exploitative, as what Unsu talked about. But what I was studying back then was environmental engineering. We were moving and making the shift in France itself back then from extractive and exploitative industries like mining to something more conscious and regenerative like clean and renewable energies like solar engineering or wind farms. So that was a major shift that was already starting in France. So those were some of the lessons I learned.
Well, I mean, it sounds like France is definitely changing, I assume for the better. But that being said, I mean, just a quick one. I mean, is this kind of thinking, right, even reaching the levels of government, or is this still, within society, within people? So, I mean, sorry, who's the French president right now?
Macron.
Macron, right?
Yes.
Sorry, Macron.
Emmanuel
Yeah, sorry.
Macron.
Sorry,
Yeah.
it just escaped my mind for a little
Yes.
bit. Yeah, and my initial, sorry, not initial, but my impression of him is that he's a neoliberalist, right?
He's a neoliberalist.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So are there political groups that are actually fronting this message of degrowth, actually?
I think there are political groups, but they're not strong enough to counter the capitalist agenda or the deep-rooted colonial agenda that they're unconscious of, or they're actually oblivious to, actually. Yeah, and so it will take a lot of conscious work to increase and raise people's level of consciousness and awareness for them to realize that we shouldn't be voting an ex-banker like Macron into the French presidency. It doesn't work that way anymore.
Also, I think from what I understand, the degrowth community so far is mostly in academia, the academics, right? So I think one of the problems of the degrowth movement is that so far, like a lot of the terminology and a lot of the concepts are academic and don't travel as far. So like I read an article where I was comparing the degrowth movement to permaculture, which came around the same time as degrowth, like in the 1970s. And permaculture is all about a way of farming and designing communities so that they are sustainable. And permaculture was much more successful in using language that everyone could understand, because the whole thing about permaculture is you kind of practice it. So it's practiced by farmers and gardeners, right? So this article made an interesting point that actually permaculture and degrowth have a lot that they could kind of contribute to each other's movements.
Yeah, so actually Jason Hickel talks about that a little bit. I even have a quote here in my notes about how he doesn't need degrowth to actually be a word for a political party. Like, it's not a bandwagon for a political party to ride on. What he really feels is that it's an umbrella term that really encompasses all kinds of ideas and policies to move past growth, right? To move into a post-growth society. So in that sense, I kind of agree with where he's coming from, because it could be political suicide for someone, a politician, to say, okay, we're going to, implement a degrowth type platform, and until that idea gets more disseminated and understood, better, yeah, it could be counterproductive, or it might not be very safe. So I want to ask you guys, right? Let's start with Unsu first, right? I mean, we are Singaporeans. We live in Singapore. Obviously, when we read this book, it didn't really apply. Like, there was not even a single word actually written about, say, rich Asian nations actually Yeah, but why do you feel like even then the content, the messages is still applicable and relevant for us?
Well, because even though, like, let's say he's talking mostly about the OECD countries like North America and Europe and their consumption levels, when I read that, I kind of recognize Singapore in that. I mean, in terms of like our technology use, the way fossil fuels are such a big part of our economy, the way we use plastics, we're definitely up there with the wealthy countries. And also, if you take into account all the trade flows that go through our ports, the military weapons that we sell to other countries, I would definitely say that we have a moral responsibility to examine our consumption patterns and how we operate as a society. And the way I look at morality is that it's like the canary in the coal mine. It's the first early warning signal that, okay, maybe we should change course. Because if you look at history, no society that has ignored the moral imperatives has eventually gone unpunished. Eventually, like, history gives this reckoning, right? Because an immoral society is not sustainable. So I think the message in the book is directly relevant to the Singapore context. And I just think in terms of, let's say, like the amount of air conditioning we use, in our buildings. We could definitely afford to try and scale down that, set our temperatures at a more, more energy efficient level, adapt our clothing and lifestyle, so that we don't have to use so much air conditioning, stuff like that.
I'll give you more context in regards to your comment later, but Santosh, why don't you go, and tell me also why do you feel this is, if it's not about the book, right, but why do you feel this is also a message that's relevant for us?
Because I think we have too much of a focus on or emphasis on GDP growth or GDP per capita growth or productivity growth, and we're not looking at other dimensions of wealth or well-being or health of our economy of our society. We're not looking at other dimensions like well-being, how people are feeling, just moving around with their daily lives. How are they feeling stressed? Are they feeling engaged? Are they feeling self-actualized with the work that they're doing? I don't see any discussions whatsoever on the other dimensions of wealth, of capital in Singapore. In Singapore, I think we focus a lot about a person's net worth, which brings into account just financial and material forms of capital. But I think we need to expand the range of dimensions of capital beyond just financial and material capital to nature capital, wisdom capital, emotional capital, intellectual capital. And then we become a more holistic and rich species or Singaporean nation. Yeah. So I think there's just this incessant drive to GDP growth and productivity growth, and it's manifested in very unhealthy forms, and we are seeing the rise of OCD, mental health challenges amongst our youths, people who just feel so disenfranchised. Inequality, economic and income inequality that's on the rise in Singapore, people falling behind, people falling through the cracks of a society. Is this the kind of society we want? I don't think young Singaporeans, for that matter, want a society like this. There was a survey that was being done on what Singaporeans want. Singaporeans don't want a wealthier country. They want a country where there is more
kindness.
There's more kindness, and there is there was graciousness was the word. I remember. Yeah, that was the word that came out in the survey. So Singaporeans don't want that, and I think we need to make an assessment of what we want as a society and decouple our instincts and this desire for GDP growth or productivity.
Okay, there's a lot to say there, but let me first go to Unsu, because you mentioned about the aircon thing and all that, and this is why I said it just now, and I'm going to say it again. I just really feel that the message from the book is not about our individual consumption patterns. Of course, it does play, an element in the whole scheme of things, but let me quote you some data, right? Okay, Singapore as a country contributes, oh, by the way, one important thing to say about this, right? Actually, the premise of why we even need to talk about degrowth is because of the climate crisis, right? We are living in a time where there's ecological breakdown, there's also climate change, but it's also more than that, right? Like soil depletion, oceans acidity rising, rising sea levels and all that. So if it wasn't for this predicament that we're in, we wouldn't even be talking about this. So that's the very first thing we need to set up, right? That is the problem that we need to solve. So again, going back to what I was going to say about the data when it comes to Singapore. So we contribute 0.11% of all emissions worldwide. Doesn't sound like a lot, 0.11. But here's the important micro data as well, which is when it comes to internally in Singapore, households contribute 6%, but the industry contributes 60% of it. And the rest of it is actually accounted for due to what you mentioned just now, the maritime and the aviation trade industry, right? Because that's the thing when it comes to measuring carbon emissions. When it comes to the IPCC, they don't actually measure the carbon emissions from trade flows. And that's the thing for Singapore, because we rely so much on importation and exportation. So that's the reason why we have such high carbon emissions. Even Jason Hickel makes a point about the Nordic countries, saying that even though it seems like they are, a good exemplary example of like being socially democratic, being very sustainable, but even for countries like them, right, they actually have very high carbon emissions. So there are some numbers here, but basically the idea here is that Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland, even Norway, they have very high levels. It's even higher than even some of the like the US and Canada. And for Singapore, actually, we rank 27 out of 142 countries. This is from the NCCS, which is our National Climate Change Secretariat. And so we actually have a lot of work in that regard.
So what is that ranking? 27th?
Out of the 142 countries of carbon emissions.
Okay.
So just to give you an idea, right? So the world average is 4.5 billion tons, right? We are at 9 billion tons. A country like Sweden is 9, a country like Norway is 14. And Jason actually talks about how even for Norway, right, 98% of it is renewable energy. So that's another actually important point about the book, which we need to discuss later, which is how in terms of degrowth, it receives a lot of criticism because there's another camp which thinks that we can actually green growth our way out of this problem, right? But that's what degrowth is about. It's actually trying to say that we can't, green grow our way out of this, because even the technology that we supposed to be dependent on, it's not tangible. There's a lot of stuff in the book which we can't go into here because it's very rich and very detailed, but the idea is that carbon capture technology is not a fail-safe solution. Yeah. So anyway, just to go back to Singapore again. So the idea here, right, is that when it comes to our climate plan, right now as we speak, right, it's actually highly insufficient, because even a climate action tracker, which is an organization, says that our climate goals, right, and we do have a climate goal, but it's not keeping in line with staying below 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. And that is actually the goal for all countries to try to meet up to. In order to do that, right, it's very simple. The idea is that we need to reach net zero emissions by 2030, but right now what the Singapore government is doing is to reach only half of that by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So you can see we are actually, way under-promising. Yeah. So again, just to let the viewers know, right, going back to what you said about consumption, there's an essay, and the essay actually says, analyze Singapore consumption patterns, and says that, like, basically if we look at our ecological footprint, so carbon is one thing, but ecological footprint is another. And that's really like, think of the stuff we are using, the plastics, the food, maybe the cars that we're buying and stuff like that, right? So for someone to live like a Singaporean, we will need 4 Earths, right? Now compare that to other countries like South Korea, 3.4, to Japan, 2.9, to China, 2.1. So we're even exceeding even these other nations in terms of how they consume, right? And the reason for that is really because at the end of the day, it's all coming from the fossil fuel industry, but also basically the heavy industries that we have. So it's not just boiling down to individual use, right? I mean, it's also about, actually that's an important point you were making about inequality. It's predominantly the very rich that also consume way in excess compared to the average folk out there. So I feel like we need to have all this in mind, so that we understand that it's not just about one person changing their consumption patterns.
I just wanted to add, like, if you want to look at economics, I think we need to change the way we look at economics. Kate Raworth, who wrote the book Doughnut Economics, said that you need to have a social foundation where you address inequalities like social and economic income inequality, and then you have an ecological ceiling that you need to account for. And in between the social foundation and the ecological ceiling, those are your limits, your lower bounds and your upper bounds for your growth targets. So that in itself can be a very wonderful quantitative model for us to then build our economic development strategy upon. So such models are already being translated from concepts and ideologies to real econometric models that can be measured and tracked so that we can achieve the targets that you were talking about. So that it's not an impossibility, it's all about the will of the people who are trained in neoclassical ways of economic thinking to transition their way to Doughnut economics way of thinking. And mind you, Kate Raworth is economics trained, and she teaches Doughnut economics at the University of Cambridge and the University of Oxford. So she is credible enough as an economist to discredit her fellow economists and the predecessors like Paul Samuelson, who conceived very archaic models of economic thinking that caused us the destruction that we are seeing in our planet and in our humanity today. And we need to reverse that destruction, and that's why we need a moral argument to shift the whole debate from a very neoliberalist and neoclassical way of thinking to something that respects and that has got reverence not only for nature but our shared humanity.
Yeah, I do want to add that I'm by no means, saying that all the responsibility lies on the personal consumer, but I do think it's not a either-or kind of situation. I think there's a very deep interrelationship between like how people express the political will or put pressure on governments and their own sort of evolution as individuals. Because I think unless you are able to take a step back from everything that your society is telling you about how you need to live your life, to consume certain things or to spend so much on education or whatever in order to lead a happy life, until you're able to step back, I don't think you're able to have that presence of mind or that stable point in which to critique your government or in which to start writing letters to your ministers to say, you know what, actually, this is not how I want our society to be. You really need people to be able to say, look, I've actually practiced this in my life. I've scaled down my consumption. I know it can be done. We just need enough people to do that. It's that knowing that you can make that personal change in your life gives you the confidence to then expect that of others. Because otherwise, everyone's just going to accuse you of a hypocrite. Oh, there you are sitting saying this is how we should do things, but I don't see you modifying anything you're doing.
Yeah, so I think this goes to the point that I've had with also some of our fellow comrades, right, in this movement, because one of the points that is very strongly articulated in this book, right, is about inequality, which actually comes back to what you were talking about just now, where you said that you want us to be or Singaporeans want us to be a nation that's more than just being financially wealthy, but in all the other broad dimensions as well. And to me, right, unless you combat inequality and you actually call it out to say that it's a malignant, right, it's a cancer that we don't want to have in society, right, then you're not going to move towards a post-growth thinking, right? And I actually have this thing here about inequality that we need to talk about, right? Because here's the thing, I think that in Singapore, so I'm going through my notes, I think that in Singapore, right, the idea here is that we have been conditioned by the government to think that economic growth is the number one imperative, right? Look at what's happening right now with our COVID recovery efforts, right? Lee Hsien Loong actually made a speech talking about our GDP. But to me, right, I'm like, I don't care about the GDP because it's not indicative of societal health, right? So I think that's one thing that we need to educate people about, right? So I'm just going to just read this out. This comes from the book. I'm paraphrasing a little bit here to make it quicker. So researchers have found that it's not income itself that matters, but how it's distributed, like what you said. Societies with unequal income distribution tend to be less happy. That's why Singapore is always considered a very unhappy place, right? Inequality creates a sense of unfairness. It erodes social trust, cohesion, and solidarity. It's linked to poorer health, higher levels of crime, and less social mobility, something that the government always says that they want to promote, right? People who live in unequal societies are more frustrated, anxious, insecure, and discontent with their lives. And it's easy to look at this in a very day-to-day example, right? So even if, let's say, you get a pay raise, right? But if your colleague next to you or your boss, gets astronomically high, salary, right? You can feel the unfairness. You can feel that, hey, for the amount of effort I'm putting, but it's not fair, because this other person doesn't seem to is benefiting more from the system than I am, right? And going back to what you said just now about trying to change that. The deep thinking, right, about our relationship to materials, right? So inequality makes people feel that the material goods they have are inadequate. We constantly want more. We don't, not because we need it, but because we want to keep up with the Joneses. The more our friends and neighbors have, the more we feel that we need to match up to them to feel that we're doing okay. So anyway, the idea here is that, like, in order to circumvent this, right, and this is where I say that it is about policy, right? So it's about having a robust welfare system, because it is in countries that have those systems, right? So that means universal healthcare. That means, to some degree, universal education, pensions, paid holidays, affordable housing, strong minimum wage, right? You need all these things in place. Then I think, that's where we can then move forward with that kind of thinking. Because as long as we're stuck here in this abyss, literally, right, or metaphorically, where the government keeps conditioning people to say that, hey, you got to keep producing, you got to keep driving forward. Otherwise, we're going to lose out to our neighbors. We're going to lose out in the global competitiveness. We are never going to get out of this trap. But there is one lever right now we can push the government on, and that's on inequality, because we can't hold them to their word. They say they're going to do something about it. I can give an assessment later, but the idea is that I don't think they're doing a good job on it. So
every other month you're reading in the newspapers about billionaires being courted by the government to set up their offices here, and so it's, I don't know, to me, the government isn't doing enough to reduce inequality.
Yeah, and to me this is one of the most important lines from the book, right? Which is, and I want the viewers to understand this, for every dollar you're making, a lot of that percent of that dollar is going to the super elite, to the super wealthy, right? I mean, there's enough population data, global data to show that a lot of the new income is going to the super wealthy. And it goes back to what you said about lighting a fire in you. That lights a fire in me, right? I'm not even working for a corporation, incidentally. But, and yet I can feel that way, because I can feel like as if, when I see my friends, when I see people, slogging in life, but to see that they're still struggling, they still feel that it's not enough, right? It's a kind of despair that they shouldn't be subjected to. And the only way to confront that is not to tell them to spend less, give them more financial advice, which is the advice that the elite likes to give, right? That you just need to stop eating avocado toast, right? And it's a whole, I mean, this is the spell that we're trying to break. Yeah, it needs to be broken, yeah. But you can see I'm very fired up.
That's great. I mean, I would say, like, I actually consider myself one of the beneficiaries of growth. Like, I'm one of the lucky ones. But even for me, even as a winner of the system, when I read stuff like that, it makes me uncomfortable. How can I be happy with my position in life when I know that it's only because I'm in this system which is so unfair? Like, I would much rather have less than I do and know that I live in a fairer system. And I'm hoping that there are other people as well who you could call, the winners of the system, who would, looking at this reality, also not feel comfortable about it and would willingly want to be part of trying to redesign the system so that we can all coexist more peacefully.
So I want to ask you that question, right? I mean, and you as well, right? Which is, have you tried talking about degrowth to your friends? Have you seen their reactions? How do they react to it, right? To people around you?
I don't really talk about it that much. I mean, like just a handful of people.
Okay.
But I would say in general, more and more people are receptive to the message. I think there's a general awareness that capitalism is broken. That's for sure. Even people that, let's say 5 years ago, would have told me that they think capitalism is the best system we have to create prosperity. Today, they would acknowledge that the system is broken. It's just that they don't see how we can possibly fix it, right? And I think it comes down to, I think most people are just cynical about the fact that human beings can actually cooperate and make sacrifices and do the right thing. They just think we are currently in a world where everyone is just pursuing their individual selfish interests or just protecting their own family and their tribe. And yeah, they just don't see how you could actually have let's say, we would need a world government to really get everyone in line, and we don't have that.
Santosh?
Yeah, I think people I know, they are in pain and they are suffering, but they don't have the vocabulary and the tools to understand what caused that suffering to begin with. Yeah. So I think there needs to be a lot of spell that is broken. One important spell that needs to be broken is this whole idea of keeping up the Jones, or this whole idea of benchmarking. So in Singapore, we have this idea that we need to grow to a certain level to benchmark ourselves against another country that has got higher levels of GDP per capita, higher levels of productivity, or higher levels of wages. But then in itself, right, it's not the gold standard. That country that we're benchmarking ourselves to, it's not the gold standard. The gold standard are indigenous tribes. And I recall my times in Malaysia when I was in secondary school, and I went and I was in the presence of the Orang Asli, the indigenous tribes, in Malaysia. And there I saw redistributive forms of an economy that was conscious, an economy that was regenerative. These are the three different components of capitalism or economy that we can bring from indigenous tribes back to Singapore. So the gold standard is not Sweden or high income or high developed countries. The gold standard are indigenous tribes. So we've got it all wrong in the first place. And I think it's going to take a lot of unconditioning to break ourselves out of that trap and that spell that you're talking about.
So this is a very good thing you brought up about how we seem to be chasing this number one status in the world, right? Okay, so let me give you again data, right? So Jason Hickel actually created an index called the Sustainable Development Index, right? And it's actually him using the Human Development Index, which is a very global measure of life expectancy, education, and income. And then what he did was that he divided it by ecological overshoots, meaning how much have we overshot our carbon budget, right? And Singapore is number one, as in the worst, okay? Because just to give you an idea, right? Okay, you talk about how we need to chase even higher GDP, right? But according to this chart, we are already at the highest with 88.155. I assume that's millions or billions of gross national income. And that's already exceeding countries like Kuwait, UAE, Australia, and the US, okay? Now what he did was that he would look at this kind of data. He then looks at our carbon emissions, which is also the highest at 28.78 tons per capita, and our material footprint, which is at 77.41. Just to give you an example, just to give you a contrast, the next nation closest to us is Kuwait. For us at 77.41 in terms of our material footprint, Kuwait's at 47.38. Wow. We've even overshoot the worst countries out there, right? So this is what I mean by like how it needs to be tackled on that very societal level. And going back to your point, right? That's why the inequality thing is such an important issue, because here's a very important part about Jason Hickel. We don't need to grow more income. There's enough income in Singapore. You need to redistribute it more fairly. Yeah, and that's the important point. That's where degrowth is so different from other schools of thought, that even if they are trying to be environmentally conscious, they still believe in this idea, hey, you just need to grow more stuff, right? Grow more national income, and then you can do all the good things like have more green technology and all that. But you don't need to do all that. It's very possible to take existing systems and convert that. But the question is, as you guys mentioned, political will, and also the the sense for people to see that this is actually not impossible is something that we can actually do. Yeah.
Another section in the book that I really liked was how he talked about, greater GDP and greater wealth doesn't bring you more happiness, and he has very good data on that. Beyond a certain level of GDP, countries aren't getting better healthcare. In fact, if you look at the US, which has one of the highest GDP per capita, their healthcare system is much worse than countries like Costa Rica or and so when you look at that, it really undermines the case for why you just need to keep growing. If you just redistributed it, as you said, we would increase the amount of happiness throughout the world population.
I just want to take a quick note, right, to say that probably by now the viewer is probably asking, okay, what would a degrowth policy look like? What would the policy platform look like, right? So I'm just going to read out some things that are lifted directly from the book. So I think it's something we haven't talked about yet. So let me run through them. So one thing is to scale down unnecessary parts of the economy. So you mentioned obviously the advertising industry, but there's also stuff to do with like SUVs, private jets, McMansions. There's all this stuff to talk about as well. Obviously, we talk a lot about GDP just now, so we need to abandon that as a measure and look at other indicators like Genuine Progress Index, GPI, and that's even something that New Zealand is doing right now. We need to shorten the working week and to redistribute labor. So think of it this way, right? Like if you're currently working in a job that's making you slog at 40 plus hours a week, you can actually like cut up that job and split it between two people, and so that both people are working at 20 plus hours per week. That leaves you way more time for what is a major priority for a post-growth economy, which is care work, right? So caring for your elders or for your children, and this is something that is unaccounted for in GDP, right? And a very important argument about what the failures of a GDP measure, right? Decommodifying universal basic services, so healthcare, education, transportation, energy. So even the healthcare industry in Singapore needs to be reckoned with. It needs to be transformed in some manner so that it's less privatized, right? And we all have equal access and fair access to healthcare services. End planned obsolescence, which means really, some of the stuff that we buy, like IKEA furniture, Apple products, they come with a very limited, lifespan, and we need to be able to have avenues to repair them so that we can use our phones for way longer. Ending food waste, having a cap fee and dividend system for carbon emissions. So that's clearly an industry level policy. What else? Institute job guarantee, roll out retraining programs for essential services. So just the other day, I think there was an article in the Straits Times about how we need more nurses. Well, very simple solution, increase their pay, right? In the US right now, that's exactly one of the things that has been miraculously been discovered, that they complain that there's labor shortage, but no, when there were more reports about companies increasing their pay to at least $15 minimum wage, then it's where they found so many applicants. So there's no labor shortage, it's just simply people need a fair income, right? I've mentioned about reduced wealth inequality with living wage, but here's another important one which I like, a maximum wage policy, right? And I found this data point which is so fascinating. CEOs only contribute either 2 to 22% or 4 to 5% of a company's results. So why do you pay the CEO so much, right? Yeah. So, and then the other important thing about Singapore is that we don't have a very robust tax system on passive income that's generated from investments. So we don't have a capital gains tax, for example, right? And again, these are things that you can do to implement, which, let's look at it on one level. On one level, most of us will not be affected by it in a way. It doesn't require us to make very drastic changes in our lives. The other thing also is that it will affect maybe only 80% of us, because it really is targeting the top 10% or even at a stretch 20% of the population. And why shouldn't they contribute their fair part to being here in Singapore and benefiting from our infrastructure and our economy and stable political environment, right? So that's why I feel that when I ask you guys about what's the reaction from friends, the reason why I love the policies from Degrowth is because when I propose this to people, they can get it. They get that, like, okay, I don't need to think about how much aircon I'm using. I don't need to think about how much meat I'm eating. Not to say these things aren't important, but you know, if you implement such wide-scale changes, then the changes would just be interwoven into daily society. So one way I explain this to a friend is that, like for example, I understand that industrial beef is very toxic, ecologically destructive, and I would like to see the industry change so that if I have to pay a bit more for beef, so be it. But you know, it's that kind of change that is more palatable versus a environmentalist telling me to stop eating beef, because you're not going to convert the whole world to veganism. You know, I'm sorry, but I don't think that's going to work. So I like this kind of ideas where it's much more receptive, I think, on a public level, and you know, I think people will like a world like that where they don't have to work so hard. Everyone's equal, and we address inequality, and we live in a greener society, right? So yeah.
If I would like to add, I think the addiction to growth is just as insidious and as serious as addiction to, let's say, cigarette smoking. And so if you decouple and if you let go of your addiction to growth, you will have withdrawal symptoms. It's going to be a very difficult journey of overcoming and going through that withdrawal period. And so I think my strategy as of now, it's not about convincing people who are already addicted to growth intellectually. I go downstream before people are even conditioned to ideas of growth when they are younger, and I convince them not with intellectual arguments anymore. I do experiential convincing. And what that means, and this is where I draw insights from ancient wisdom, and there are two parts about ancient wisdom that I would like to talk about. When I work with youths or young change makers, I bring them on a nature walk. And there is no talking, there is no discussion whatsoever. It's an experiential journey of understanding how your being changes. When you enter nature, can you just start to observe how better you start to feel? Now, that is an insight that ancient wisdom teaches us, which is we are actually not skin encapsulated bodies, separated from other skin encapsulated bodies or nature. Actually, we are all one. We are part of nature, and nature is part of us. And so, experientially, they start to understand at the level of identity that if they were to extract and exploit from nature and man, they are causing harm not to nature or man, but to themselves. That is an experience that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. So this is the kind of work that I'm doing. The second insight from ancient wisdom is this insight on the human mind. I think there's a lot about ancient wisdom that teaches us about the science of the human mind. One science is the science around desire. Now, what ancient wisdom teaches us about desire is the fulfillment of a desire has got several negative consequences. One, it is temporary. So you fulfill that desire, consumption for example, right? But it's temporary. Number two, it's unsatisfactory. And number three, which is the worst of all, it creates more desires. And so the only way to curb consumption or our desire to grow, produce and consume is to understand the nature of desire that causes us to want to even consume or grab that product, thinking that it will satisfy something within us. And it's to understand what is that existential hole or gap that particular product or thing that's outside of us is trying to satisfy or meet. So that is, those are two insights from indigenous or ancient wisdom that I now employ in my strategy to help convince people about degrowth. And once the experience is embedded, it is somatically embedded, it's embodied, they feel it, then the intellectual arguments can come and convince them. So I think there are some strategies that we can we can formulate to just educate community and the younger ones who are going to inherit a world that we're going to leave behind.
I do like your approach a lot. I mean, I read in another book called, I think, Initiation to Sojourn. It's by this guy, Bill Plotkin. And he talks about how, like, in modern societies, we are lacking these rituals where people can get mature out of the childhood and adolescent stage into full adulthood, right? And adulthood is all about stewardship and responsibility. And because we're lacking these rituals, a lot of us, even till our 30s or 40s, are still stuck in the adolescent stage, right? And it's almost like we all need to go through this eco-awakening. So I feel I've already had my eco-awakening, where I now consider myself as part of this ecological system that I depend on, and it depends on me as well, and it's this relationship. But I think if you look at people who just mindlessly consume plastic bottles and throw it on the ground, like they probably haven't gone through that awakening. But I acknowledge what you're saying too as well, Douglas, about like it is also very, very like the urgency is to change things on the policy level. I definitely don't disagree with that, and I think like in the area of policy making, I just want to make this qualification that none of us are experts or policymakers. We definitely shouldn't be the ones to figure out what the policies should be. But I think what we do need to do as a society is be willing to talk about bad ideas. And why do I say that? It's because in order to get to where we need to go, we need a radical transformation of what we're doing. It's not about tweaking the system or whatever, right? And in order to get to that radical place, we actually need to go through the stage of having bad ideas and then modify them until they become good ideas. If you don't go through the bad idea stage, you will never get to the good ideas that we need, right? So I just want to pitch to you guys like one bad idea I had recently, and I know it's a bad idea, but when I was talking to my friend Marcus Cole, who's a permaculture farmer, and we were just saying about the fact that if we wanted to feed the population using permaculture principles, we definitely have too high a population in Singapore. Like we cannot do it at the population level we're at, right? So we need to reduce our population somehow. How do we do that? Well, the fact is we rely, like a third of our population is migrant labor, right? And we are told that we need all this migrant labor because who's going to build the HDB buildings to house locals, right? That's one example. So I was thinking, okay, let's say we no longer have this migrant labor population. How are we going to like build more housing for locals? Well, then I was like, okay, we have all these migrant worker dorms that are supposed to house the migrant workers. That's all now going to be empty. What if we offered to the poorest segment of Singapore, right, to be able to live in these spaces for free? They don't have to pay anything for it. Their food, housing, shelter, all covered. These spaces will be set up as communal spaces with communal kitchens, right, where everyone has to kind of support each other. There's communal forms of entertainment. And I was just thinking to myself, if you gave people the choice, a lot of people might actually choose that. They might say, oh wow, I don't have to worry about paying rent, food. Yes, the living conditions might be a bit more cramped, but the benefit of that is maybe I always miss the kampong sort of spirit, like we're now closer together, we help each other. So anyway, that's kind of like my bad degrowth idea.
Sorry, just to clarify with you, your idea is specific to poor people to live in the worker dorms?
Yes.
I actually would put that on the rich to live in the worker dorms. Yeah, because I wanted to get a taste of the migrant worker experience, not the poor. I get where you're coming from in terms you want to provide better welfare for them and you want to construct a kampong-like environment. And I certainly think that, my heart is in that direction, but it's more that I don't want them to be isolated from society. I actually want the poor. Well, it actually brings up a very recent anecdote from a friend of mine who was making a stereotypical assumption that poor people live only on the ground floor, right? So actually, I would rather combat that and have poor people live on the higher floor, and I would prefer to have a more intermingling of classes. Yeah, that's actually where I would go to in terms of an idea like that to construct a kampong-like spirit. Yeah, but I just want to also take a note about what you said about defeating bad ideas, and I fully, am also 100% on board with you on this. And Santosh, about how the richness of indigenous wisdom. I think people need to appreciate that a little bit more. And actually, you made a lot of references to Malaysia, and I like that reference as well, because I was thinking also, just before making this video, what if we were to ask people to envisage, right, living in Singapore and living in Malaysia, right? Is it really that different in terms of quality of life? I mean, minus some of the major issues that Malaysia has internally, perhaps some of the infrastructure issues can also be resolved better, right? Can be upgraded. But really, at the end of the day, do people in Malaysia live a much poorer, much sadder, depressive life compared to us in Singapore? Perhaps not, right? And I think we can take a page from that and see also from that angle. So I want to share some quotes from Jason Hickel because they are so profound and so sharp, but it also goes to what you said about bad ideas, right? So give you a good one, right? So number one, millionaires and billionaires don't produce value. They primarily capture value produced by others. That's one. Every additional dollar of income that goes to rich people heats up the planet with zero benefit for human well-being. The ecological irrationality of inequality is staggering. The notion that one's income reflects their productivity or the value they contribute to society is one of the most pernicious fallacies of neoclassical economics, right? Representative democracy is really not democracy at all. Society should be governed directly by its members, and the problem of scale can be solved by something like the revolutionary democratic federalism that's being tried in Rojava. So anyway, let's talk about the iPhone. The iPhone is exemplary of American capitalism in that it's produced almost entirely in the global south with southern resources and southern labor, and yet the profits are booked as GDP in USA. So I think these are like some of the key, that's why I love following his Twitter, because these are such beautiful quotes that really encapsulate, what is wrong with our thinking, right? Because we are thinking in the opposite. We've been conditioned to think in the opposite, or worship the billionaires and the millionaires. American capitalism is the engine of innovation, where this is all like fallacies. Yeah, and I do think that in that sense, you're right. Like we do need that, and actually there is that also, the very deep part of the book where he talks about Descartes versus Spinoza, right? Do you want to go through that a little bit, because it dovetails with his indigenous?
I don't remember that section actually.
Oh, it's the one where, okay, so remember like in our talk, right, you mentioned about the mechanistic philosophy of Descartes, right? So Jason Hickel also alludes to that as the poster child of Enlightenment. And of course he's no critic of the Enlightenment project in general, but what Jason also did refer to is how that particular bit of dividing the mind and the body has become one of the foundations for neoclassical economic thinking or instrumental rationality. And in that sense, when we look at objects in the world, the trees, the rivers, we see them as separate objects, and all we think about is how much to exploit it. But whereas Spinoza came in from a different direction and look at these things as one with the world and one with the universe, and that what we do to these objects also affect us retrospectively. And there's a very important word that Jason uses, which is the de-thinkification of materials and objects in the world. We need to have that kind of philosophy so that we can break away from the growth mindset. Yeah, and actually that goes to another important policy thing, which is how in certain countries rivers and mountains are now being given rights, and that's an offshoot of the power of indigenous culture, right? And we need to go through this on another video, but we do need to talk about why are corporations given legal personhoods, right? Because giving them that kind of power actually excavates the rule that they have over us.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Like I think if you can give a fictitious company like Volkswagen an identity and personhood and the powers of personhood, why shouldn't you extend that same right to rivers and mountains and natural resources? It makes total sense to me.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you want to have any concluding thoughts first? I have an ending quote, which is basically from the book, but...
I have an ending quote too.
Oh, okay, why don't you go first?
Mine is 2 minutes long.
No, go for it.
Are you okay with it?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe perhaps you just capture it from mine.
Sure. This is actually from his acknowledgements. Like, you know,
I think you've got the...
this book is so amazing that even the acknowledgements are beautiful. So it's kind of a story.
Yeah.
So it is said that the Buddha told this story as a warning. A couple were traveling across the desert with their only child. Their food supply ran low and they grew hungry. But driven by an insatiable ambition for their destination, they refused to change course. As if in a trance, they decided to kill and eat the child to sustain them. When they arrived at last on the other side, when the destination lost its allure and the trance lost its grip, they were utterly hollowed with grief and regret. What are we doing here? Where are we going? What's it all for? What is the end, as it were, of human existence? Growthism prevents us from stopping to think about these questions. It prevents us from reflecting on what we actually want our society to achieve. Indeed, the pursuit of growth comes to stand in for thought itself. We are in a trance. We slog on, mindlessly unaware of what we're doing, unaware of what's happening around us, unaware of what we are sacrificing, who we are sacrificing. Degrowth is an idea that shakes us out of the trance. Sit, be still, and listen, Rumi wrote in one of his poems, for you are drunk, and we are at the edge of the roof. This is not about living a life of voluntary misery or imposing harsh limits on human potential. On the contrary, it is exactly the opposite. It is about flourishing and about reaching a higher level of consciousness about what we're doing here and why. But the trance is powerful. To escape it requires escaping the ruts grooved into our minds, the assumptions baked into our culture, the ideologies that shape our politics. That is no easy task. It requires courage and discipline. Yeah, I mean, I just love that as a, statement.
So that is also the same quote I wanted to use, but I have other quotes, but Santosh, why don't you go ahead with some concluding thoughts?
Yeah. I think when we talked about intermingling, we can look at intermingling across multiple lines, not just race, which is what we have in Singapore, right? Intermingling of races, but also you talked about socio-economic class and income. And how about nationality? Intermingling of nationalities, genders, and family structures. And yeah, so I think we can look at intermingling across many lines. And if there's something that I would like to share, it's about the ancient rituals. You talked about rituals, right? I love rituals. I think we've lost a lot of indigenous and very rich rituals. One which is, in the African tribe, when the way they feed one another, they put a soup, in the middle, and they have a ladle that is very long, and it's deliberately made long so that when you scoop the soup from the ladle, you can't feed yourself. The only choice you have is in feeding someone. You can only feed someone. And so the idea behind that is through feeding others, I get fed. So these are important rituals that indigenous wisdom can teach us. The whole idea of Ubuntu. Ubuntu means I am because we are. So what I benefit, you benefit as well. What pain I have, you have the same pain. What pain you have, I have the same pain. And it's about this whole idea that you talked about, which is Spinoza, or from Advaita Vedanta by Adi Shankara, which is the whole idea of attacking the problem at its roots, which is at the level of identity. Who are we to begin with? There's another African, very small and short parable, right? A group of youngsters, small kids, were lined up, and then they were told that there's a prize at the there was a prize to be won in a tree, let's say 50 meters away. And so the person said, now this is a competition. I want you to run, grab the prize, and the first person who comes back to the finishing line is the winner. And so what happened just blew their minds. What the kids did is they ran together as a whole and as a community. They grabbed the prize together and they ran back together. Now, when the person asked them, like, why didn't one of you become an individualist and compete against everyone? And that's where the children replied, but it's because there's no point one person winning when it's all of us the same as one person. So I think there's a lot of wealth to indigenous wisdom that we can bring and build in our rituals when we educate young people or even old people.
So I want to say, in concluding that, I really love this cross-pollination of ideas because, for example, I'm not very strong, obviously, on the indigenous knowledge. And so it's good to have you. It's also good to have you, Unsu, to show this much passion also for this project. Even though, as you acknowledge, you've been a benefactor of the system. So I just really want to conclude with a few things, right? So number one is this is Jason Hickel's first book. So we talked a bit about just now about how the North exploits the global South. So do look into this book if you want to find out more. That's very important. Also, when it comes to climate change in Singapore, we have some good books like this ones. And actually, I do want to give you guys homework. So this is one book I'd like us to cover because it dovetails very nicely with what we're talking about in terms of materialism, consumption, and stuff like that. And definitely has a lot of bits about degrowth as well. So that's one thing. And then, I just really want to finish with, so Jason Hickel impressed me a lot because he was in a debate with two other opponents. So this was held in Doha. And, they're very formidable. One was the former president of Mauritius, this woman, who's also a biodiversity scientist who argued for capitalism. And then there was Anand Giridharadas, who is a journalist, and he's very much a lefty as well, and who, although he acknowledged problems with capitalism, he felt it was just all to do with redistribution. So anyway, just to sum it up, Jason was actually not doing so well in the beginning of the debate, but he won over the audience by the end. So this is actually his last, this is sort of the ending speech, so I'm just going to read it out. So here it goes. Reducing unnecessary production means freeing people from the drudgery of needless labor, and by shortening the work week and rolling out a job guarantee with living wages, we can ensure that everyone has access to meaningful work and dignified lives. Some say we need economic growth to achieve social progress, but that is a lie. The vast majority of income from growth gets captured at the very top, while most people see very little benefits. Once we wake up to this madness, the solution becomes clear. We already live in an abundant economy. We don't need more growth. We can achieve progress right now without any growth at all, simply by sharing what we have more fairly. Justice is the antidote to growth. So we can maintain our devotion to the dusty dogmas of the status quo, sacrificing our future and our planet on the altar of capital, or we can throw off the shackles of this irrational system and build a better, more just, more ecological economy for the 21st century. We have a choice before us, growth or life. And this is the choice we have to make.
I choose life.
I choose life too.
Right. All right. Cool. Anyway, so this has been a blast. I suspect we're probably going to revisit this from time to time, and I think it's great.
Yep. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.